This is a short video in which I want to share some thoughts on issues around pleasure, in particular, whether pleasure is intrinsically valuable, whether pleasure is what motivates people, the anticipation of pleasure that is, and so on. So I'll start with the issue of motivation. So a common assumption that people make, which is known as motivational hedonism, is that what drives people is the anticipation of pleasure or the anticipation of a reduction in pain. Now this is definitely false. What makes it false is the fact that it doesn't get to the heart of what actually makes pleasurable things pleasurable. Any explanation behind why people have the motivations that they do must consider why it is that people have the desires that they do. And you can't say, well, their desire is just to get pleasure, because it doesn't explain why it is that certain things cause pleasure and other things don't. Mostly what motivates people is not the anticipation of pleasure. That doesn't mean that the anticipation of pleasure cannot be a contributing factor to motivation. It is just not what goes to the heart of the nature of motivation. Rather, that is some sort of urge or drive, something within our vital being, which is the life energy body, or the physical being that has an urge for something. For example, we have an urge to consume food, a drive to obtain food from the environment. Why? Because food keeps us alive. This is an instinctive urge that humans and other animals have. The reason we get pleasure from eating is because it fulfills that drive. Now, there are other factors as well. There are certain things that will be more pleasurable, certain foods that will be more pleasurable than other foods. But generally speaking, the reason that the consumption of food is pleasurable is because it is a means to the end of sustaining life and health. An example of when this comes up is on the topic of veganism and food ethics. So people who consume animal products will often say, I could never be vegan. I enjoy animal products too much, which is often framed in terms of taste. I like the taste of meat. But here the word taste is being used to mean something like get pleasure. That's their way of describing the fact that they get pleasure from it. But when people become vegan, they often lose their desire to consume animal products. They don't get pleasure from consuming animal products anymore, precisely because they simply don't desire those animal products anymore. So what's really going on is that they have the urge to consume animal products, and that urge comes from our subconscious mind. It comes from the collective subconscious specifically, which has the urge to consume animal products because of the fact that historically humans have depended on animal products in order to live. We have needed to use animals for all sorts of purposes, not just food, but also that. So the urge is rooted in that dependency that has historically existed, and what has happened is that the psychology of that is outliving the circumstances in which that came into existence. But that doesn't mean it's immutable. It in fact can and does change. People do lose the urge to consume animal products, for example, by changing their habits or by undergoing some other kind of change, like a spiritual change or something like that. So I claim that the main thing that determines people's pleasure and pain is their desires, and there's no one thing that determines their desires. There's all sorts of different things, evolutionary facts and facts about our other beliefs and attitudes and so on, that can then influence our desires. The other claim that I'm going to argue for is that pleasure is not the purpose of life. Certainly it's not the only purpose of life. Now, pleasure is intrinsically valuable in my opinion, but this is on a holistic, not an atomistic understanding of intrinsic value, which means that while it is intrinsically valuable, it is not always valuable. What that means is when it is valuable intrinsically, not instrumentally, but it is not always valuable. There are some contexts in which pleasure is not a good thing. For example, a person who gets pleasure from unjustly causing pain to others. But while pleasure is intrinsically valuable, it's not the only valuable thing, of course. I'll call pleasure the subjective good. And by the subjective good, I just mean that it's in our own minds. And by pleasure, I should be clear, I mean any positive mental state. It could be contentment, it could be just anything that feels good. And pain is anything that feels bad. There are objective goods as well. And there's a certain correspondence between the subjective good and objective goods. The correspondence is that the subjective good is a recognition of the value of objective goods. So for example, suppose you're listening to good quality music. You feel good when you listen to that music. The reason is because there is some value to the music objectively. It has aesthetic value, it has value as a creative work, it has value because of what it expresses, and it is that value that explains why it feels good to listen to that good music. The reason that the presence of God feels good is the fact that God is the thing that has ultimate value and a high degree of value. This is why the purpose of life cannot just be pleasure. If the purpose of life is goods, to experience good things, for example, then that is not just pleasure, because pleasure is not the only good. The purpose of life is the right and the good. There's a hierarchy of goods, with the spiritual good being the highest level, and then after that, context does determine where something falls within that hierarchy. Additionally, the aim of life should be something ultimate, but pleasure is not ultimately good because its goodness is determined by the goodness of something else. The correspondence between subjective and objective goods is also the explanation behind why drugs are bad. Because what drugs do is, for the most part, they give you pleasure while bypassing the objective good that explains and justifies that subjective good. For example, if someone snorts cocaine, there is no objective value in the cocaine itself. I mean, technically all being has some objective value, but that doesn't explain the increase in pleasure that you get from snorting the cocaine, because that general goodness of being is there even if you aren't snorting the cocaine. It's there in all matters, so it doesn't explain why specifically snorting cocaine makes it so that you have this increase in pleasure as opposed to snorting like chalk or something else that is the same amount of stuff but does not alter your mental state in that way. So we'll put aside the general goodness of all stuff for the purposes of this point. Normally when you feel good, it's because of some objective good, but in this case you're getting the subjective good without the objective good, so in a way you're stealing goodness from the universe. And of course the universe will get its own back, which is why taking drugs makes people feel sick. It negatively impacts their physical health and their mental health. That's an application of the law of karma, where they are experiencing something bad because they did something wrong. It is making up for the pleasure that they took. It's being taken back from them. That's one way that one can think about it. Even in the instance where pleasure is not the main reason why somebody takes a drug, so for example, people who consume alcohol don't do it always for pleasure or mainly for pleasure. They do it mainly for a disinhibition effect. It is still the wrong means for a disinhibition effect. It is still the wrong means for whatever the desired result is of taking any drug. This is a problem with all drugs. Caffeine is a bit of an exception, but not completely. Caffeine is a bit of a nuanced issue. I'll put aside caffeine for now, but when it comes to at least non-caffeine drugs, there is a general structural problem, which is that the consumption of a physical substance like a powder or a liquid or whatever, bringing about certain alterations in mental state, is not something that should be happening except for in certain pathological cases, like a person is in extreme pain, so they consume an analgesic or an anesthesia or whatever in order to not be in pain anymore. But when you don't have pathology, then your normal correspondence, the way in which your mind responds to the world, is either correct or it's self-pathological. If it is correct, then it does not need intervention in the form of drugs, in the form of these chemicals. But if it is itself pathological, then that means that there is a chronic problem, and that's not going to get resolved by the consumption of drugs. So for example, if a person is chronically excessively inhibited, so they actually do need a disinhibition effect, which alcohol gives them, then that means they have a personality problem and they need to work on that. But if a person, when they're sober, is not excessively inhibited and is actually perfectly fine in their inhibition, then they will become too little inhibited by consuming the alcohol. In summary, pleasure is often but not always good. When it is good, it is intrinsically and not instrumentally good. The purpose of life is the right and the good, and while good does of course include pleasure within it, it also includes other things. And the goodness of pleasure itself is determined by, among other things, whether it corresponds to an objective good. When there is no objective good and there is an attempt to obtain a subjective good for free, so to speak, without an objective good that is, then that is wrong. And that will result in bad things happening to the person who does that, which is what happens in the case of drug taking. This also explains why drugs are wrong, and is a better explanation than simply saying drugs are bad for your health, because this explains why drugs are bad for your health. It gives a bit more of a systematic and philosophical explanation for why drugs are wrong. Okay, bye.